so much for coming out. So I trained as an architect, I worked in cities, I've been interested in cities my whole life. You know, for me, I first stumbled into landscape architecture as a graduate student. And for me, most of my work has been, as Carol was mentioning, thinking about ecological processes and thinking about the city through ecological lenses, let's say. So this is a new piece of work. I've given this talk, or a version of it, once in LA a couple of weeks ago, so I'll look forward to workshopping it with you. It's not in any way settled, it's not resolved, it's kind of new, and I look forward to your feedback. And it's my first time to visit the Skyscraper Museum. I've known it, and I've known Carol through her reputation and her work on Ferris. And so I have very little to say about Ferris. I'm here to learn. But what I want to suggest to you is I think that we're on the verge of a new economy, a new solar economy. And one of the things that appeals to me about the topic is that it's absolutely ancient. And almost anything you could imagine on the topic has been done already. Right? It's settled, it's resolved. And that's part of what appeals to me, is the fact that in some ways I think we're on what I'll claim to be a new economy. The earliest regulations about how you might build in the city come in the Western tradition from ideas about social equity and access to light and air. This is enshrined in British common law. It's enshrined in general social codes around the world, in fact. And the origins of modern urban planning, both in Europe, in the UK, and in the United States, emerge from this idea of trying to regulate density, regulate urbanization through social and policy mechanisms, with the idea that some modicum of access to light and air is somehow fundamental. Carol mentioned the 1916 zoning ordinance, and the idea that at this moment, with the kind of emergence of modern tools of planning, modern policy, we have both a question of social equity, right? The idea that no matter how little money you had, no matter what your social status, you somehow deserved light and air at a minimum, could be enshrined in both legal frameworks, but also in spatial frameworks. So that this sectional condition, the avenues and the streets of Manhattan and Commissioner Street could be carved up in a way with respect to making sure that as the city develops, as it will through a range of independent private actors, we all have access to something. For our purposes, it's not just the policy piece, it's also Ferris's contribution of what I'll call a cultural imaginary. So it's a combination of rapid urbanization in the 19th and 20th century, the codification of policies, legal frameworks, zoning ordinances, and the like, and its enshrinement in the 1920s and 1930s in a set of cultural images that are now, iconic, let's say, right? So it's the combination of all of those actions at the same time that produce a regime that comes to be thought of as kind of Manhattanism. We could do a similar version in Asia, we could do a similar version in London, we could talk about Paris. So you could talk about this mythology in a number of ways, but for our purposes, the entry point is the idea that urbanization, the city as a site for the reproduction of capital, the manifestation of building fabric on the one hand, is regulated through a social and political economy, and that access to light and air is somehow a social equity issue. Over the course of the 20th century, of course, this idea of access to light and air and social equity becomes a very important leitmotif in the work of many, many planners. Ludwig Hildersheimer is somebody that I've written quite a lot about, a German planner, worked very closely with Mies van der Rohe, was at the Bauhaus for the rise of fascism. And on that topic in the 20th century, of course, you'll be familiar with the work of Victor Olje. For my purposes, you may be less familiar with the work of Vladimir Mattis. Mattis is the person who first uses the term, as far as I can tell, heliomorphic urban design. So it's not my formulation, it's Mattis. Mattis was a Canadian urban planner working in Ontario in the 1960s and 70s and 80s. And in his book, Design for Northern Climates, he essentially argues for a heliomorphic urban design as a strategy. Mattis was working a little bit in response to the ascendancy of the Barcelona project. Barcelona in the 1980s, the emergence of a kind of cultural condition in Barcelona, kind of political emancipation from the Spanish situation, and the idea of the city as collective work. But for my purposes, the person I'm most interested in here in this work is a fellow called Ralph Knowles. So this is Ralph Knowles at the University of Southern California. Ralph Knowles is an architect who's trained at MIT, where he worked with a number of pretty interesting people in the 1960s. He goes to USC in the 1960s as an assistant professor, and he begins developing a line of work where he's interested. You can see this heliodon. This is this kind of mechanical art that can simulate with models the shape of the sun. He develops a concept called the solar envelope in the 1970s and 80s. His dissertation on energy and form from MIT is also interesting. So he's doing systems theory, the idea of urban form in relationship to energy modeling, but at a very high kind of mathematical conceptual level. And then in his teaching, he has his students do things like this, these solar envelope studies from the 1960s and 70s, in which you can begin to see an envelope that he argues is an envelope of social equity, in which urban form could be extracted so as to ensure sunlight and view lines toward the sun for others. It's important to note here that these are essentially for Knowles kind of zoning envelopes, right? These are envelopes or massing potentials. And then within that, he would have his students do architectural projects, buildings not unlike this kind of interesting kind of egg crate formulation. So this is pre-digital, right? So this is all analog, building physical models, using this heliodon tracking device, and using some fairly crude tools compared to what we have today. I happen to be friendly with an architect called Tom Morphism. Tom and I have known each other for years. I saw Tom on a jury a couple of years ago, and I said, Tom, I'm so excited. I found this guy, Ralph Knowles. I'm so excited because this guy is working on this heliomorphic stuff, and I think this is really a new way forward in my research. And Tom said, my dear boy, everything I learned about architecture, I learned from Ralph Knowles at USC, because of course Tom was a student at USC. And what he learned from Ralph Knowles was not just heliomorphism. What he learned from Ralph Knowles was the idea of taking a single parameter and charging it, driving it as hard as possible so as to produce some non-linear, counterintuitive formal outcomes, right? The idea of not simply form following function, but the idea of taking a parameter, a performative parameter, in this case solar performance, and pushing it as hard as possible to get to some other cultural condition that we might think of as having more autonomy. And I think it's buildings a little bit like this that Tom was doing as a student at USC back in the day. There you go.
Go ahead.
Yeah. So for our purposes this evening, I won't rehearse much more than that at the history of that, but it's something I've been reading into for the last year and a half or so. We did this conference that Carol mentioned at the GSD a year and a half ago now, when I first started this Office for Urbanization. Office for Urbanization is an applied design research lab. We work with cities, World Bank, we work with a variety of different foundations around the world, and we work with cities in this kind of work. And so, of course, we now have a range of new tools that you guys will be familiar with, and we can now see around the world what I'm claiming is a new heliomorphism, a new body of work being done by a range of different architects in different contexts, using new tools to apply kind of solar performance to new formal outcomes. And I'll mention SOM and Roger Duffy just briefly, given where we are. But I also wanted to suggest that in addition to the formal performance of buildings, their shape, right, we also see a range of actions, a range of activities in which buildings have actuators, they respond in heliomorphic ways to various site conditions. But we see a range of buildings that are interested to bounce light into the shadow of each other. So a whole series of projects around the world that you can see that are really twinned, in which they compensate for each other's shadow projection, right? We also have seen these heliostats around the world. So we're just here near Teardrop Park, the site of one of these heliostats. These are big mirror arrays. These were initially developed in European contexts, the Germans in particular, basically using very large mirror arrays to bounce sunlight into otherwise darkened or shadowed urban spaces. These are examples coming out of Australia. But around the world, my point is that we see a range of new projects in which solar performance is a driver of urban form, but in a much more complex economy, more complex in formal terms, but also more complex in terms of questions of equity and access, well beyond what we were able to do in the context of the 20th century.
Excuse me, are these actual pictures or artists' renderings? These buildings exist?
They do, many of them do, yeah.
Thank you.
And so in this case, I don't want to make any great claims about any one of those individual projects, but collectively, there's enough critical mass out there around the world with these projects where, oh, architects are working in a different way. So there are three elements to this. On the one hand, there is still the need or the desire to differentiate, especially very large buildings, from one another, right? So that's been with us for a very long time. This building, this museum has really chronicled that story over many, many decades. The second tendency that we see is the desire by many architects and urbanists to bring ecological function into their work more directly. And then finally, this desire to more directly focus on questions of social equity, right? So all of those examples, they're very different. We can talk about them, but I've got a couple of cases that I'll spend a little bit more time with.
It's up high.
What's that?
It's up there.
Is it up there? Does that help?
Is that it? I don't know where.
No.
No, it's not. Where is it?
It's down there. There's one other battery though, sorry.
Pardon me.
I can sit with
How
that
about
if
this?
you give it next.
How about
Tell
this?
me next.
Yeah, how about this?
Look at the battery.
That's right. I can do it here.
Well, then you won't be in the video.
Oh,
Keep trying,
Pardon me?
and in the meantime, I'll do next. Ready?
You've got the old daisy lectures.
that's right.
You have to say next.
Next. Thanks a lot. Next. So if we just spend a couple of minutes and just look at Manhattan since the turn of the millennium as a kind of laboratory, as a kind of case study, I'll say a couple of words about that. Should I try this again?
Try it, but no, we had to switch computers so that.
All right, thanks. My apologies.
Next.
Thanks. Yeah. So we did a little catalog next of did a little catalog of tall buildings in Manhattan. Next, I just run through these tall buildings in Manhattan since the turn of the millennium. Next, in which
Oops, sorry.
thanks, Karen.
You want the next one?
Please, yeah. And you can just keep rolling slowly through these. We're in the context in the last several years of a renewed anxiety, let's put it, about tall buildings. If you follow the discourse around so-called billionaires' row and anxiety around shadows in Central Park. So far as I understand, there have been shadows in Central Park for a very long time, right? That's not new. And I use the term anxiety specifically to not really take a side in that debate, but with the idea that we can see, on the one hand, the desire for view shed, the desire for bundling air rights, the desire for buildings which are iconic and configurable. This is, of course, in the West's 57th, Björk Ingels, BIG, in which the idea of a courtyard perimeter block becomes shaved relative to solar performance in other ways. You've seen Municipal Art Societies responded with their accidental skyline reports, and there's an interactive feature. You can go online, you can see the impact of these tall buildings on Billionaires Row. Again, the anxiety about what will these buildings do to the park, what will these shadows do to life in the city. And again, I don't want to make any value judgments about that. I just think it's clear that this is an ongoing, very long-standing, longue-durée consideration. And you can see here the impact of these shadows across Central Park. So my thesis is very simple. Historically, if we had this axis of solar economy, which was really the regulation of capital accumulation, capital reproduction, urbanization, and the city as a site of capitalization on the one hand, versus questions of social equity, right? So the emergence of zoning, planning in both the European and in the North American context emerge out of that idea of, well, we have capital accumulation in the city as a site of unbridled reproduction of space. And if we let that go too far, we'll all die in the dark, right? And that somehow social equity needs to balance that. And so in this framework, planning emerges as a kind of political economy, like a kind of referee in a way, between social equity on the one hand and capital accumulation. Next. My claim is I believe that we're on the verge of maybe another axis to this diagram, which is really a biopolitical or ecological axis, which is simply saying we want access to light and air and to sunlight doesn't necessarily tell us what we want that sunlight for. And I believe that in fact there are some zero-sum trade-offs as the surface of building skins are increasingly symmetrical with the surfaces of energy production. We're not quite there yet, but it seems clear that we're tending in that direction. It's my claim that we might be on the verge of this other axis between sunlight in the public realm, right? So sunlight on you and I, and sunlight for the birds and the bees, sunlight for those kinds of ecological purposes on the one hand, versus the production of solar energy on the other hand, right? And that there are trade-offs, and I'm interested to use this project to mobilize questions about those choices that we're making. So, next. And you can run through that, the next couple of those. And for me, the solar envelope, just pause it, the solar envelope sits exactly at the intersection of those two things. In this regard, I want to highlight two case studies from Manhattan in the recent past that I think are notable in this regard. This is a building by Jeannie Gang. Jeannie Gang is another architect friend of mine who I chatted with about this a couple of years ago, and I said, Jeannie, I'm very excited. I found this guy, Ralph Knowles, who's going to be my new bête noire for a couple of years. I want to recuperate this guy. I think his work is really interesting and timely. And she said that when she left OMA, where she was practicing for many years to start her practice in Chicago, studying Gang Architects, Ralph Knowles was the first person that she interviewed for precisely the same reason. So Jeannie was recently lecturing at the GSD on this building, Solar Carved Tower. And you can see here, this is not too far up the island. You can see the High Line in that green, 13th Street, 10th Avenue, West Side Highway over here. And this is a diagram, a volume. You can see in red the parcel that she and her developer colleague were developing. And you can see the outline of the building setback. Right, the street wall, the building tapering, following the 1916 zoning ordinance, right? Kind of following the letter of the law. Next. Within that, this is a diagram of what, this is what could be built given the density that they were trying to build and the program that they were developing, which is a kind of mixed-use hotel, condo, residential development. Next. And so what Jeannie and her team proposed was to take that volume, the same FAR, and to flip it, contravening the 1916 zoning ordinance, doing exactly the wrong thing for the avenue, to put the mass on the avenue, arguing for solar access to the High Line. Next. And in doing so, next, she was also arguing for a kind of performative solar envelope that could shape this building as well. Next. And so in addition to light on the High Line and light on the, presumably the kind of terrace, amenity terrace for the residents of this lovely spot. Next. We also see it becomes a part of the way that the building's character is developed, right? Next. And so in this case, we have, Solar Carved Tower, Jeannie Gang, a couple of years ago, arguing for moving FAR, and as far as I understand, I'm led to believe, I think it's true, it's among the first buildings in Manhattan that have been allowed to move the massing to the wrong side, to put it against the avenue, so as to open up sunlight onto the High Line, onto the park.
Sorry.
Roosevelt Island. Sorry. Same time frame, a couple of years ago, Roosevelt Island, the Cornell Tech campus. This is a building project called the Bloomberg Center by Tom Main, Heliomorphism. Thanks. So you can see this here on the left. It's a building which is really among the first buildings of this new Cornell Tech campus. Great aspirations to be zero energy neutral, right? At this latitude, that's not trivial. And one of the ways they do that is by this very large PV array, this very large roof, which is like twice the size of the building. I love Tom. I think it's a great building. It's like an aircraft carrier. It's fantastic. It produces an enormous shadow save. What I'm interested in here is that both Tom and Jeannie are looking at the same mentor, Ralph Knowles, right? They're both running the same software, right? And from that, they're deriving ultimately conflicting outcomes about what's solar good. Do we want solar energy to be carbon neutral, arguably an ecological good? Or do we want to carve the buildings away so as to allow sunlight into the street next? Next. And you can, next, you can just run through these quickly. So in this context, these are just two examples next from around the world next of projects that I believe illustrate this tension, this new economy between various forms of solar performativity, a new heliomorphism. And what I'm interested in is that the politics of that are not obvious, that you can make an ecological high ground argument in either case. And this makes it a little more nuanced and a little more subtle than just the 1916 zoning ordinance and Ferris and the like. Next. So in the Office for Urbanization, as I said, we're a research lab. We work with sponsors and colleagues around the world in various applied design research projects. And so this piece of work and this piece of research has been developed with my colleague Aziz Babar, who's here. Aziz has really been at the kind of forefront of this work with us over the last couple of years. So we decided to do just a kind of thought piece to look at the Commissioner's Grid, 1807, and then to look at the zoning ordinance 1916 as modified in 1961 and see, well, what would be possible as of right next? And you can just run, so this is 1916, typical block next. And then we looked to try to optimize that, you can just run through these slowly, by holding same FAR, same density, and following as much as possible to optimize the reduction of shadow in the public realm. So just a thought exercise that has kind of potentially formal outcomes, and we studied it at a range of different block scales next. You can just run through these. To begin to see what that kind of prototypical Manhattanism might be like if we were to adapt it toward this idea. So the idea of the point tower, the perimeter block street wall as optimized, let's say, manipulated so as to maintain as much as possible the existing density while changing its formal outcome. And if you just keep running through this, Carol. So this is a kind of, it's a kind of counterfactual history in a way. And we find this way of working interesting because we're not certainly proposing that this would be built, but what we're interested in is to study it against the history of Manhattanism and against what's found in Manhattan and our collective imaginary about that. And to then tease out of that, puzzle out of that, well, what are the possibilities affording new buildings these days, the context that we're looking
Are we supposed to think about the position of this north, south, east, or west, or this doesn't matter?
Sure, yeah. I mean, one of the reasons we chose Manhattan was because it has this great cultural history, and it's very precisely 23 degrees, 26 degrees, 28. 28. For you, Manhattan Hinge, enthusiasts out there, it's very precise. There's a very specific latitude. There's a cultural history that's been built around that latitude. And so all of these studies were done around the Commissioner's Grid, around that orientation to north, and around this latitude. So it makes it very precise to this location, and then provides a kind of counterfactual history. As Carol mentioned, the most recent piece of work we did with this, Aziz led a team of our researchers that installed a piece of work in the Chicago Biennial last September. Was it September? Wow, that seems like a long time. This is a piece we called Heliomorphic Chicago. Just pause there for a second. So this is an installation that we did, again, looking at the history of Chicago, and especially tall buildings in Chicago, and looking at the question of solar performance. So we did two things. We did a pair of large models that we'll show you, and then we identified a range of significant tall buildings in the city's history that we then studied in this kind of counterfactual way. So you can now move through these. And we paired them again, equity versus energy, right? So we have historic, canonic tall buildings in Chicago. We have the idea of optimizing their form, on the one hand to reduce shadows in the public realm, or on the other hand so as to maximize the collection of solar energy for energy production. Next. And you can see here 868A Lakeshore Drive, right? And they're similar, some of the morphogenetic properties, the formal properties are similar in some cases, but you end up with some very interesting and sometimes counterintuitive or nonlinear at least kind of spatial outcomes. I think the Marina City is the model that I have in my office now that I'm most interested in terms of its formal development. And so that's the piece of the loop that we modeled. And so we did two models of the kind of downtown core loop of Chicago, modeling it in two different directions, one for solar production and one for the production of shadow in the public realm. And then we did a series of these large maquettes. These are about the size of your podium, and a field of them that you could inhabit, walk around, and experience. And this was in the tall building section in the main room in the fourth floor of the cultural center. And so again, we're interested to kind of frame the question. I was very happy to be right next to my friend Ludwig Hilbershammer here. Very happy just to frame the question, just to pose, okay, so we have these new tools, we have this new heliomorphic economy, what are we to do with this knowledge? Now that we're all running the same software, it's not really a technical question. In my mind, it's really a biopolitical question of social equity in a way. And so hopefully you'll begin to see how this fits into my ecological agenda, but brings us a little bit more directly back to questions of urban form. Landscape urbanism has been productive for a variety of reasons that are now available. But for me, we really always need to stay close to the question of urban form and to the métier of design in a way. I think for all its success, I think landscape urbanism benefits from having a very strong agenda about urban form. And so in that way, the work of landscape urbanism, I think, is complemented by having this as an agenda for formal outcomes around building form. Thanks. And so the last piece I want to share, just before we can open up, maybe have more of a conversation next, is a piece of work I just presented yesterday to the city of Miami Beach. This is a research project that we've engaged with them for the past 2.5 years, looking at their adaptations to sea level rise. So it's a real world, much more complex environment. This is a couple of examples in which we begin with a landscape urbanist agenda for water, hydrological performance, ecological capacity on Biscayne Bay. And we postulate that as Miami Beach elevates up out of the water, as they rebuild themselves at a higher level next, that there may be the desirability next for finding greater ecological capacity on the bay side, and that bringing in strategies of ecological infrastructure, green infrastructure, if you will, next might be useful here. And then to those studies, we then began to develop these heliomorphic studies, as these and I, with our students, to look at solar performance, thinking that Miami Beach is another interesting venue that is really built around the economy of the sun. Half the people in Miami Beach want more sun all the time, they want to be in the sun. The other half want to be in the shade all the time. And so again, it's not immediately obvious which of those is more desirable next. And you see here a range of student projects. This Andrew Model is now teaching at the University of Tennessee next to some this very interesting study, beginning by studying the bay ecology, developing patterns out of that ecological performance, and then using that to inform a new kind of block structure. And so I'm hopeful that this, next, and you can just run through these now. I'm hopeful that these are examples, in addition to these historical narratives, that might give you a sense of how this stuff might be useful going forward. So we now have this workflow that Aziz and her team have developed available, and we're developing for a range of projects that we're consulting with people around the world. And, thanks. It's very generous of you guys to be here this evening. Thanks so much.
Going to interject that this last view looked like Bruno Taut and Paul Scherbart in the German expressionist 19-teens, right? With the kind of skeletal, diagonal, utopian motivations.
Yeah, there's a little. I mean, if you were to skin that differently, it would be closer to Björk Ingels up the street. But whether you express the balcony or not, I think for us. Like, we're committed in the office and our work to the idea of design research, we're committed to the idea that design is a legitimate form of knowledge production, especially in the context of a university. And we're also committed to addressing challenges in the world and what we call alternative and better futures for people. So, but you guys have been very generous to come out and to hear this again. It's a work in progress. I don't have this sort of, I'm really looking for your feedback. This is the kind of thing that after a year or two of this, I'll have my argument down and I'll know what to include and what to highlight. So it's very much, it's not yet in print also. Like I did a very short piece for the Seoul Biennial last year that's available. It's in print. It's in the catalog for that.
So I can launch questions. And do you imagine inspiring people to adopt this idea, regulating them in the same way that 1916, I mean, regulation is certainly a lot more effective and productive than establishing a higher goal for people to aspire to. What kind of application do you think is realistic
Sure.
to incorporate?
I mean, personally, you know, where I fit into this kind of work is, for me, in my career, I've always thought about going through upstream to hearts and minds. You know, I'm an educator. I've worked my whole life in education. And for me, I feel like my work is most effective if I can set the agenda for a period of time. And just as an example, because it's available, that's how landscape urbanism played out over the last 20 years, basically. It was colleagues of mine and myself and others had a set of critiques of the existing operating choices that we had. And we tried to do some serious inquiries and critical, analytical, and historical work, and then to develop a kind of what Andres Duani has referred to as a kind of operational playbook, you know. And I think if this goes similar, I'll be very happy, but nonetheless, the idea is to influence thought leaders, you know, to both influence a generation through education, but also to try to get out ahead of. For me, I've always been more on the cultural capital side than on the regulatory side, but I think the example from 1916 is interesting because I think they're most effective when they're both, right? I think generally things emerge through culture first, in my worldview, and then they become more broadly socialized, and then, you know, the policy and legal frameworks tend to be conservative, they tend to happen later. But in some cultures it happens the other way. Sometimes it's, you know, we can do a little bit of work in Asia where it's much more top-down. And I'm open to which comes first, but for me it's more the economy between those things. It's not just policy regulation, and it's not just cultural capital, but the combination of those things. And then bring into that mix a sense of social, even political agency, you know, like often it's those three things, a sense of what's just in a body politic or a civil society, that yes, that's how it should be, combined with cultural capital and something regulatory. And I think it'll play out in different ways in different places, but what I see is that the first actors in many cases are architects and urbanists and their projects. So most of what I'm showing you are large buildings, and I'm interested more in the collective urban project. And so one way to get from the large building to the collective urban project is to regulate. Another way is to build a new piece of city, like has been happening here over the last several decades. And so in that sense, mostly I'm interested to look at building projects and see how they might be generalizable at a more collective scale, questions of collective form.
Do you all have questions?
I mean, have you seen some of these ideas applied in particular places in different parts of the world? Like China has fairly strict, you know, solar access codes and things like that, which don't always create the nicest places.
It's true, yeah. So yes, there are many places, certainly in East Asia, certainly in China and parts of the former Soviet sphere, in which a kind of Soviet-style, you know, modern planning is still the basis of code. And what we're finding, and this is still very early on, but what we're finding in those conversations is there is a kind of cultural awareness and a kind of policy literacy about those issues. But in those kinds of, but also probably in the West, it's similar, a kind of regulatory environment that enforces an existence minimum can often produce undesirable outcomes. And so for my part, what I'm interested in here is the idea that unlike in the modern era where we said, well, here's the law because we're all the same, this allows for cultural difference. You know, it allows us to make a choice. You know, I mean, Mies is famous for having said that, you know, he didn't like sunlight in his bedroom in the morning, and that's why at Lafayette Park he rotated buildings with a domino helicopter pattern. And so I'm interested in the idea that it's a cultural question, and it's also requiring the agency of architects. It's not simply a kind of Bauhaus or a kind of rolling out of a sort of modernist agenda for optimization.
He's always had a hangover in the morning.
Never met the man. I don't have to say one way or the other. Yeah.
It almost sounds like an argument for like feng shui and geomancy, which in Asia they still do for you know, planning buildings like, you know, whereas maybe in the West, like in New York City, we would talk about sunlight and air access as just like a quantity and more is good, and that's kind of the end of the discussion. So I guess really what you're proposing is looking at all of these decisions as a trade-off, right?
Yeah, that's right. I think that's right. Yeah, I mean, I think that, for me, feng shui is a little bit on the transcendental, a little bit on the mystical side for me.
To bring it up.
But for me,
as you were talking, then it popped in my head.
one of the reasons that I'm drawn to this, and after a couple of years of searching for the right way back into questions of urban forms, the landscape urbanism has been productive, but it's kind of, we've gotten very good at the wet stuff. We've gotten very good at the performative landscape structure. But what draws me to this is it's absolutely empirical. It could not be more scientific. And just having the science doesn't tell you which is better, sunlight or shade, right? That becomes a very social, political, human question in the end. So I'm drawn to the idea that we can measure it very precisely, and we can tell you very precise statistics about its performance, but it still doesn't tell us, do we want zero carbon energy or do we want sunlight on the flowers,
So you sort of, I guess, you're leaving that up to the sort of regulatory, social, cultural side.
Civil society, yeah, I mean.
Right.
Absolutely.
To sort of make the decisions based on the data drawn from this.
That's right, that's right. So the analogy to landscape urbanism would be, in landscape urbanism, you see these projects that are really organized around certain species, right? Certain celebrity species that are most often seen to be civic good, right? A kind of cultural imaginary somehow. And so in that sense, I don't think it would be my place. I'm not so interested to determine which is better, right? Lower carbon energy production or better sunlight on the streets. But for me, the idea that there's an economy there that architects have agency about, that we can enter into a debate about. And this will really, in a response to the failures of modernism, enable us to work differently at different latitudes, right? So, but at the same moment, be culturally specific. And just the fact that in Manhattan we have these very different examples happening right now. Björk Ingels, Tom May, and Jean Gang doing utterly different things with similar tools and in the same regulatory and economic climate. I find that very heartening. And I want to step back and claim, well, there is a kind of biopolitic of solar performance there in all of those projects. And that might help us think about them and think about collective outcomes a little bit more precisely. Yeah.
I have a comment and questions
Please.
from the voice. First of all, comment is thank you for your studies and your road and landscape urbanism has changed my professional experience, but also my teaching. Students have been reinforcing that for a long time and finding a constant inspiration in that. So when I saw this presentation begin, I was always moving to object, is living the fields. So who I'm looking for now, so who is the mentor now? But I can see that those objects are seen within the fields, that the ecology and urban concept is coming in within the object and rolling and try to perform with it. In a context where you are looking for sunlight, what happens in other places, you're saying that this is a site-specific study. What happens in other places where we are looking for shade and to be safe from light.
Yeah.
So how is this tool, how performable is this tool to these different needs and contexts? Out of the world is looking for shade.
Yeah. It's a very kind comment. Thank you for being here. For me, I'm always drawn to things that are relational and collective, and therefore somehow potentially political. It's unclear, we started with this idea of looking at latitude as a context, right? And I think this is in part a desire to have the ability to respond to climate, energy, and to find a biopolitical ethic, let's say, without returning to or rehashing, the critical regionalism project, right? If you give me just 2 seconds. So in architectural history and theory, we've unpacked the idea of region and race, right? We no longer talk about people as being from certain places. But in landscape discourse, the idea of what I used to call nativity, until Mike Clay says I can't use that word, I gotta say nativism. The idea that, species are appropriate to a place, which strikes me as utterly, utterly racist, and coming out of a xenophobia in the 19th century. I think we have a lot of work to do to unpack that. And as we're doing that, I'm critical of that being replaced by a generic kind of neoliberal globality. And so I've been looking for ways, and in the Landscape Urbanism playbook, you can see ways in which the cultural imaginary, the specifics of an ecology, like produce certain species in certain conditions, and you can see projects that respond to that in a very direct way. But my critique of that, while it's been successful, is too often the urban form ends up being a kind of global, generic, and in response to that, we now have people and practices, we have academic programs that are doing landscape urbanism very effectively, I think. There's more work to be done, but it's operational, to use Dwani's term. Whereas the question of urban form, we seem to be a little bit adrift. I mean, in most cases in the world, what I see, and I see a little bit here in Manhattan, individual agents, landowners, developers, and their architects. So everything ends up being a kind of singularity. And when we talk about the city, too often it's this architect is attached, this developer has the air rights, oh, it's that parcel, it's the Olympics, it's the football stadium. And the narrative that we see in the public imaginary, in the media, becomes very much about the singularity of one, if not one building, at least one initiative. And it becomes very difficult to adjudicate and talk about that in relationship to other things collectively. On the other hand, we've had the neo-traditional, my friends in the new urbanism and the neo-conservative movements that have been very effective, mobilizing for several decades, arguing for a certain kind of reactionary urban form. And I've always been looking, both in landscape urbanism and now in this project, for a progressive culture. Where can we be progressive but be specific? And I'm hopeful that this will allow us to be specific to latitude and to cultural sensibilities about light and air. And so we're doing a project just now looking at new town planning in different parts of the world. And it's the first moment when, in addition to the solar performance envelope, we're being able to bring questions of humidity and light, and hopefully in a cultural way. And my goal, I'm not anywhere near this yet, but my goal is to move beyond the formal implications of cultural specificity and to try to get at something maybe more performative, but at the relationship to climate, humid, temperature.
Other questions? I'll ask one more question then, since, in the span of decades, well, there are many decades that we've been talking about sunshine and architecture in cities, but in the green building movement, which really only goes back maybe 15 years or so, at least in cities and commercial architecture. We did a show which I thought was pretty cutting edge at the time in 2007 called Green Towers for New York, when the first buildings that were embracing the idea of some kind of regulation and standards in order to save energy made the point across these buildings that the only way that you could ever convince building owners and developers to embrace this idea was if you could demonstrate how much money it was saving. And money hasn't entered your description at all, other than as capital, right? As this kind of abstract notion about how cities exist. Don't you think that energy savings and saving dollars or currency is an extremely persuasive argument to marshal in order to convince people that a project?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, almost everything I've shown is underpinned with capital. Everything, the economy of building cities, of course. Cities are both a location of and a reproduction of capital. And we have a number of doctoral students at the GSD working on these problems just now. This is one of them, in fact. Mariano Gomez-Luque is working on a dissertation he's calling the very tall building reconsidered. And it's looking exactly at this relationship between the individual building, right, and its iconicity, and its capacity for reproducing the world, and at the same moment, its collectivity, its impact on the world. So there's no doubt, both, or all three, if the Bjork Ingels, the Tom Mann, and Jeannie Gang examples from recent experience in Manhattan, they all come directly out of our contemporary neoliberal economy. They're all individual owners developing as of right, and one's an institution, right? So one is a college campus. So they have different forms of finance, different regulatory contexts, but none of them are conceivable absent our present economy. And so I don't mean in any way, I don't believe, just to let you know a little bit more about my politics of this, I don't believe that in the cultural sphere that we can use culture like this to push back, to change that political economy. But I do think that in the same way that, you know, the Cornell campus was motivated to be energy neutral, is that a fiscal decision? In part, is it a social equity, ethical position? In part, is it, you know, there are many, many motivations that go into these things. And ultimately, it's the imbrication of those decisions that I find so interesting. And so in that sense, whatever the political economy is, or whatever the economic logic of each project is, what I'm interested in is the role of the architect in bringing forth other possibilities, right? Other forms of what we used to call metropolitanism, you know, other forms of cosmopolitan life. And for my part, in the academy, we have the luxury of stepping back a little bit, or in forums, because we can step back and talk a little bit about, well, isn't it interesting that, you know, dozens and dozens of architects around the world seem to be stumbling in the last 5 or 10 years into a similar set of questions. For me, that's interesting, and it's not trivial, and a part of my work is to try to make that coherent as a picture, and I don't think I've done that yet tonight, but hopefully, if you stay with me for a couple of years, I'll look at that. Thanks a lot.
Whose first time is it here? Curious. Great. Well, welcome very much. I hope you've been attracted by our illustrious speaker tonight. But before I introduce him, I'll just tell you about, for a moment about the museum, and if you have time to look around afterwards, then this exhibition on Lower Manhattan in the 1990s is something that I hope you'll find interesting and you'll come back to see. We do a couple of shows a year, and if you come back in July, we'll have a new exhibition called Skyline up. We like to explore topics in New York City history in our lectures and programs and in our exhibitions. And we like to range across the whole history of the skyscraper and the urban scene. So we like to explore topics, research topics in depth, and oftentimes in concentration of periods that try to kind of chew off a piece of New York City history, or to look broadly internationally at themes of urban development. So I guess that's a little bit appropriate to tonight, because Charles Waldheim, who is professor at he's actually the John Irving Professor of Landscape Architecture at Harvard's Graduate School of Design, the GSD, leads what is now called the Office for Urbanization. He used to be the chairman of the department, but they just changed all the departments around, so that they just reorganized how they call things. So now, even though it's in the university, it's called the Office for Urbanization. And he is someone who has really pioneered in the idea of landscape architecture, or landscape urbanism. So in his topic tonight, which I was introduced to when I visited back last fall, Chicago, and the Chicago Biennial that featured an installation that I hope we're going to get to in your slides, because I saw that it's almost at the end, a really stunning presentation of this heliotropism idea, bringing an analysis of the angle of the sun and the effects, because there are at least two effects in terms of social terms and physical terms of thinking about sunlight in cities. And he presented that project and the team from his office in Chicago, and I think he'll show you those. And I thought, oh God, if he had this for New York too. So I listened to the entire heliotropism conference that is on the GSD's website, that you can listen to for quite a few hours, morning, I think afternoon and evening, where ideas as old as the Egyptians and as old as the earliest modernists apply the importance of the sun in our world. And as you'll see in his slides and his talk tonight, the history of New York and its skyscrapers also connect in the first zoning regulation to the idea of saving sunlight for the streets of New York and the people of New York. So I'm really curious, having spent a long time in my own scholarship focused really pretty narrowly on the 1916 zoning law and its impact in the 1920s, of really cross-examining him, now and later about that talk. So just by way of giving you some of his exceptional publication history, he's been the author and editor of Landscape Urbanism, study of Hilbersheimer and Mies on Lafayette Park in Detroit, the airport landscape, urban ecologies in the aerial age, and Is Landscape, essays on the identity of landscape. But one that I just pulled off the quote on the back of his 2016 book, Landscape Urbanism, A General Theory, has a blurb that I don't know if you wrote or not, or somebody else did, but it's very eloquent.
If you like it, it's mine. It was marketing.
This person wrote, "It has become conventional to think that urbanism and landscape, of them as opposing one another, or to think of landscape as merely providing temporary relief from urban life as shaped by buildings and infrastructure. But driven in part by environmental concerns, landscape has recently emerged as a model and a medium for the city, with some theorists arguing that landscape architects are the urbanists of our age. In Landscape Urbanism, one of the field's pioneers presents a powerful case for rethinking the city through landscape." And I think it's for that reason that landscape architecture has been one of the most popular areas of application in schools of architecture in these last few years, and that's, I think, in large part to Charles Waldheim. So here he is to talk about it.
Thank you so much.